What if the South had won the American Civil War? The battlefield lies shrouded in smoke. Cannon thunder rolls across the horizon, musket fire crackles like a storm, and shattered regiments stumble through blood-soaked fields. In the chaos, flags of blue and gray clash in the wind, their cloth torn but defiant. The year is 1863, and the United States trembles at the edge of destruction. The fate of millions hangs on the outcome of a single war, the Civil War, the most brutal conflict ever fought on American soil. We know how history ended, or do we? Tonight, we step into a world where destiny bent the other way, a world where the South emerged victorious. What would that America look like? And what price would the world pay if the Confederacy had triumphed? In the spring of 1861, the fragile union that had bound America together finally collapsed under the unbearable weight of contradiction. For decades, the Republic had lived with a festering wound. A nation that declared liberty as its creed, yet tolerated slavery as its foundation. The Founding Fathers, unable to solve the paradox, had left it for later generations to confront. By the mid-19th century, that reckoning could no longer be delayed. Every compromise in Congress was only a bandage stretched across a widening fracture. Every new territory admitted to the Union sharpened the debate over whether freedom or bondage would expand westward. And with each passing year, the storm grew heavier until the lightning inevitably struck. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, Southern leaders saw not a politician, but a threat to their entire civilization. Lincoln had promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed. Yet his victory signaled that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The South feared that their voice in Washington would be drowned, their institutions attacked, their way of life doomed. Secession became, in their eyes, an act of preservation rather than rebellion. One by one, states broke away, South Carolina first, followed swiftly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, representatives of these states met in Montgomery and declared the birth of a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The North, stunned but resolute, refused to let the Union unravel so easily. Lincoln, inaugurated in March, faced a crisis unlike any in the young nation's history. Could the American experiment survive dismemberment? To surrender the South was to admit that the Union was not perpetual, that any state could leave whenever it disagreed. But to preserve the Union would require war. When Confederate cannons roared at Fort Sumter in April, the choice was made for him. The war had begun. At first, many believed the conflict would be brief. In the North, it was assumed that sheer industrial might and larger numbers would crush rebellion quickly. In the South, the conviction was that a single dramatic victory would force the Union to the negotiating table, perhaps even draw Britain or France into recognizing the Confederacy. But illusions met reality on the fields of battle. The Union possessed nearly every material advantage. Its population was more than 22 million, compared to the South's 9 million, of which nearly 4 million were enslaved and thus not free to fight. The North's factories poured out rifles, artillery, and uniforms by the tens of thousands, while its shipyards produced the vessels that would enforce a strangling blockade along the southern coast. Railroads crisscrossed the northern states, carrying troops and supplies with a speed the South could only envy. The Confederacy, by contrast, relied heavily on cotton exports to finance its war effort, and gambled that Europe's dependence on that cotton would force foreign recognition. Yet the South had its own formidable strengths. Its generals, men like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, embodied a martial tradition that stunned Union commanders again and again. Its soldiers, though fewer, fought on familiar ground, often with a ferocity born from defending their homes and families. Most of all, the South possessed determination. They were fighting not for conquest, but for survival, and that desperation forged an iron resolve. The first great clash at Bull Run in July 1861 shattered Northern hopes of an easy triumph. Civilians who had ridden from Washington to watch the spectacle fled in panic as Union troops broke and ran. The message was clear. This would not be a short war. At Shiloh in April 1862, more than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, numbers so staggering that the nation reeled in shock. With each bloody confrontation, it became clear that America was caught in a struggle of annihilation. Meanwhile, the political stakes only grew higher. Lincoln, pressed by abolitionists and the sheer brutality of the conflict, began to see emancipation as both a moral imperative and a weapon of war. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he reframed the conflict not just as a fight for union, but as a struggle for freedom itself. The Confederacy, conversely, anchored its very identity in the defense of slavery, even as its leaders insisted they fought for states' rights. The clash of ideals became as irreconcilable as the clash of armies. Beyond America's shores, the world watched intently. In London and Paris, mills sat idle as Southern cotton vanished, while newspapers speculated whether recognition of the Confederacy might serve Europe's interests. Britain's navy ruled the seas, France's empire stretched across continents. Both powers knew that a divided America could be manipulated, controlled, or courted. A Confederate victory might ensure the permanence of slavery, alter the balance of power in the Atlantic, and prevent the United States from ever becoming the colossus it was destined to be. Thus, as the war deepened, the stakes grew larger than the continent itself. Would the Union endure as a single nation? Would liberty expand, or would it fracture permanently, leaving two hostile republics glaring across a blood-soaked border? No one in 1862 knew the answer. The fields of Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi became altars where tens of thousands paid with their lives for a question that could only be settled by fire and steel. And so, the war marched on, relentless, merciless. Each battle was another drumbeat in the symphony of destruction, each death another stone laid upon the altar of destiny. The American Republic had entered its darkest trial, and its very soul hung in the balance. But as the storm raged, few could imagine just how close the scales of history would come to tipping, and how differently the world might have turned had fortune favored the other side. By the dawn of 1862, the American Civil War had already shed more blood than the nation had ever imagined, and yet it had only begun to reveal its ferocity. The lines of battle stretched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River, from the forests of Virginia to the swamps of Louisiana. Entire landscapes were transformed into graveyards, and towns that had once known only the hum of commerce now echoed with the clash of arms and the wails of the wounded. The war had become not a brief quarrel, but a struggle for survival, and its shadow loomed over every corner of the divided land. The Union, under President Lincoln, pressed its advantage wherever it could. A grand strategy was slowly emerging, nicknamed the Anaconda Plan by journalists. Like a great serpent, it sought to coil around the Confederacy, choking it from without by enforcing a naval blockade and splitting it from within by seizing control of the Mississippi River. With New Orleans captured in the spring of 1862, the plan began to take shape. Union gunboats prowled the great river, cutting off vital lifelines and strangling Southern trade. Yet each mile of water, each bend of the river, became a battleground fiercely defended by Confederate batteries and infantry. In the Eastern Theater, the Union Army of the Potomac, led at first by George B. McClellan, attempted to strike at the Confederate capital of Richmond. McClellan, cautious to a fault, advanced slowly during the Peninsula Campaign, and when he finally reached the outskirts of the city, Robert E. Lee seized the moment. The 7 days' battles in June and July of 1862 were a whirlwind of maneuvers and bloody encounters. Though Lee's arms suffered grievous losses, his audacity forced the Union to retreat, saving Richmond from capture and cementing his reputation as a brilliant, if ruthless, commander. But victory for the Confederacy did not mean safety. The Union's strength was vast, its manpower seemingly inexhaustible. Every Southern triumph bled its armies white, while Northern defeats only hardened resolve. At Antietam, in September 1862, Lee carried the war into Maryland, hoping to win recognition from Europe and to inspire the border states to join the Confederacy. Instead, he met the Union Army on the banks of Antietam Creek in what became the single bloodiest day in American history. Nearly 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The battlefield was a nightmare of cornfields cut down by musket fire, bridges slick with blood, and sunken roads piled with bodies. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle gave Lincoln the opportunity to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. With a stroke of his pen, the war was transformed. No longer was the Union simply fighting to restore its borders. Now it was waging a moral crusade. Slavery, the institution at the core of the Confederacy, was declared a target for destruction. The proclamation did not free every enslaved person immediately, but it ensured that the war's outcome would decide the fate of millions. For the North, it rallied abolitionists and gave the conflict a higher cause. For the South, it deepened desperation. For now, their struggle was not only for independence, but for the preservation of the very system upon which their society rested. The human cost of the war grew unbearable. Soldiers marched until their feet bled, fought until their muskets jammed with black powder, and watched comrades fall by the thousands in fields that became oceans of mud and gore. Civilians endured hunger, shortages, and the constant fear of invasion. Plantations once buzzing with the forced labor of enslaved people were disrupted as the Union advance encouraged escape and rebellion. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta strained under the weight of war, while northern towns mourned endless lists of dead published in their newspapers. Across the Atlantic, the great powers deliberated. Britain's textile mills lay idle, starved of cotton, while France eyed the conflict with ambition. Recognition of the Confederacy was whispered in the halls of Westminster and Paris, yet always postponed. The Emancipation Proclamation complicated matters, for how could liberal Europe openly ally with a nation fighting to preserve slavery? Still, the possibility lingered like smoke over the horizon. A decisive Confederate victory on Northern soil might tip the scales, granting the South allies, arms, and legitimacy. Thus, by the end of 1862, the war had hardened into something greater than politics, greater even than the borders of the United States. It was now a conflict over the very meaning of freedom, fought with a ferocity that stunned the world. From Fredericksburg, where Union soldiers charged futilely against impregnable Confederate positions, to Vicksburg, where Union forces prepared to besiege the bastion that controlled the Mississippi, the land itself seemed to groan beneath the burden of war. Every month brought fresh graves, every season new campaigns, every family new heartbreak. The United States, once a beacon of democracy, had become a house divided against itself, and the world watched to see whether it would endure or collapse into two rival republics. And as the war marched grimly onward, one figure in particular began to emerge from the smoke. A man whose decisions would shape not only battles, but the very destiny of nations. By 1863, one name had risen above the rest, carried on the smoke of cannon fire and the whispers of soldiers who had followed him through triumph and despair alike: Robert Edward Lee. To the Confederacy, he was more than a general. He was a living symbol of their defiance, a man who embodied the honor, discipline, and sheer audacity upon which their hopes rested. His calm presence in the saddle, his piercing eyes beneath the brim of his hat, gave men the courage to charge even against impossible odds. Where Lee commanded, the Confederate cause seemed to burn brighter, even in the darkest hours. Born into one of Virginia's most storied families, Lee had once worn the blue uniform of the United States Army. He had served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, his brilliance already evident in the way he read terrain and anticipated enemy moves. When secession came, Lincoln himself had offered Lee command of the Union armies. But Lee's loyalty to Virginia outweighed all else. He could not raise his sword against his home, and so he resigned, casting his lot with the South. It was a decision that changed history. As commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee proved himself time and again. At the 7 Days Battles, he had driven McClellan back from the gates of Richmond. At Second Bull Run, he humiliated Union forces once more, and at Fredericksburg, his men, dug in on the heights, inflicted a slaughter so appalling that the hillside seemed carpeted with blue. His genius was not merely tactical, it was psychological. Lee understood that the South could not win through attrition. The Union's factories and manpower would eventually grind them down. The Confederacy needed decisive victories, blows so stunning that Northern morale would collapse and foreign nations would be compelled to intervene. But the Union, too, had found its champion. In the Western theater, a hard-nosed general named Ulysses S. Grant was carving out victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. Unlike many of his peers, Grant did not flinch in the face of casualties. He fought with relentless pressure, hammering the enemy until they broke. Where Lee was daring and swift, Grant was unyielding and methodical. Inevitably, their paths would converge, but before that day came, Lee sought one more grand gamble to alter the course of the war. That gamble would lead him northward, across the Potomac River, into the green fields of Pennsylvania. Lee's strategy was bold, almost reckless. By carrying the war onto northern soil, he hoped to relieve pressure on Virginia's devastated farms, gather supplies from untouched land, and above all, strike a blow that would shatter Union confidence. If he could win a decisive battle on Union territory, the calls for peace in Washington might swell to irresistible volume. Perhaps Britain or France, impressed by Confederate strength, would finally recognize the South. Perhaps Lincoln's government would falter under the weight of defeat. And so, in the summer of 1863, Lee's army moved north. The fields of wheat rippled beneath the hot sun as columns of gray and butternut marched through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Civilians watched in terror as Confederate cavalry scouted their towns, and church bells rang an alarm across the countryside. Behind Lee's calm demeanor lay a storm of calculation. Every step northward carried both opportunity and peril. On the Union side, the newly appointed General George Gordon Meade raced to intercept him. The Army of the Potomac, battered and demoralized after years of defeat, now faced its greatest test. Could it stop Lee's audacious thrust and protect the very heart of the Union? The two armies, numbering more than 150,000 men combined, were on a collision course. Neither side could retreat without sacrificing everything. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not only the fate of the war, but the destiny of the nation. In early July, on the rolling hills and ridges near a small Pennsylvania town, the thunder of cannon would once again shake the earth. Gettysburg, a name that meant nothing then, would soon be etched in history forever. And here, at this critical crossroads, history balanced on a knife's edge. We know how it ended: 3 days of brutal fighting, Pickett's doomed charge, and Lee's retreat back to Virginia. But what if the outcome had been different? What if, on those bloody fields, the South had triumphed instead? Imagine the hills of Pennsylvania in early July 1863. The sun rises over fields already scarred by musket fire, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of powder. Union soldiers, weary from 2 days of savage fighting, brace themselves for another assault. The ridges of Gettysburg have held, but barely. Behind their lines, wagons groan with the wounded, and officers whisper that morale is breaking. Then, on the morning of the third day, General Lee makes his choice. In our reality, it was Pickett's charge, a desperate gamble that ended in ruin. But in this alternate history, fortune bends differently. Lee coordinates his attack with ruthless precision. Instead of a single doomed charge across open ground, he orchestrates a series of hammer blows. James Longstreet's corps does not hesitate, as he had in our timeline, but strikes with full commitment, sweeping around the Union flank. At the same time, J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry crashes into the rear, disrupting supply lines and sowing chaos. The Confederate artillery, resupplied by daring night raids, unleashes a thunderous bombardment that silences key Union batteries. When Pickett's men finally surge forward, it is not a futile dash into withering fire. It is the final spear thrust into an enemy already reeling. The Union lines buckle. Regiments break and run. General Meade attempts to rally his army, but panic spreads like wildfire. The once defiant Army of the Potomac dissolves into retreat, streaming back toward Baltimore and Washington. For the first time, Lee has delivered not just a tactical victory, but a decisive triumph on Northern soil. Gettysburg, in this world, becomes not a symbol of Union endurance, but the Confederacy's crowning glory. News of the disaster spreads with astonishing speed. In New York and Philadelphia, newspapers print headlines of catastrophe. Lincoln, gaunt and sleepless, paces the White House corridors, his government shaken to its core. His political enemies seize the moment, declaring the war unwinnable and calling for immediate peace negotiations. The Copperheads, Northern Democrats opposed to the conflict, gain new strength, filling city streets with protests against what they call Lincoln's folly. The Union, bloodied and humiliated, begins to fracture from within. Across the Atlantic, the impact is electric. In London, Prime Minister Palmerston, long cautious about Confederate recognition, now sees an opportunity. If the South can win such a staggering victory, perhaps it is destined to endure. Britain, desperate for cotton to feed its mills, begins secret talks with Confederate envoys. France, under Napoleon III, follows suit, eager to curb American power and secure influence in Mexico. Recognition of the Confederacy, once a distant possibility, now looms on the horizon. For the South, the triumph is intoxicating. The soldiers of Lee's army, ragged and hungry only days before, march with pride as they push deeper into Pennsylvania. Towns surrender without resistance, offering supplies to avoid destruction. The Confederate flag, once confined to the states below the Mason-Dixon line, now flies defiantly in northern skies. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis proclaims a new dawn. The independence of the Confederate States is no longer a dream but a reality, forged in the crucible of Gettysburg. Yet victory carries with it new burdens. The Confederacy must decide how far to press its advantage. Should Lee march on Washington itself, risking overextension? Or should he consolidate, forcing Lincoln's government to the negotiating table from a position of strength? Within the Confederate High Command, debates rage. Some argue that occupation of Northern territory is impossible, that the South must focus on securing its borders. Others demand boldness, insisting that now is the moment to break the Union once and for all. In this alternate timeline, boldness wins. Lee advances, not with the reckless abandon of conquerors, but with the careful precision of a man who knows that history itself hangs on his decisions. Washington quakes with fear. Though its defenses are strong, the capital is vulnerable. Its citizens panicked. Its government divided. Lincoln considers evacuation, even as his cabinet urges negotiations. And so in this world, Gettysburg is not remembered as the high-water mark of the Confederacy. It is remembered as the moment the tide turned, the moment when the dream of Union victory crumbled. The war is far from over, but the balance has shifted irrevocably. The South has seized the momentum, and the Union faces not just a military crisis, but the possibility of political collapse. And as the smoke clears over Pennsylvania, the question grows sharper. What new world will emerge from the ashes of this Southern triumph? The summer of 1863 becomes a season of thunder. In our timeline, Union morale rebounded after Gettysburg, but in this alternate world, the blow is crippling. Panic spreads like wildfire across the North. The once proud Army of the Potomac is in tatters, limping back toward Baltimore, leaving a trail of abandoned wagons and shattered regiments. Confederate cavalry raid deep into Pennsylvania, seizing stockpiles of food and ammunition, burning rail depots, and cutting telegraph lines. For the first time, northern cities feel the war pressing at their very gates. Washington, D.C. is a city on edge. Refugees pour in with tales of Confederate columns sweeping across the countryside. The capital's defenses bristle with cannon, but whispers circulate that Lee himself is approaching. Abraham Lincoln, worn down by sleepless nights and crushing responsibility, walks the corridors of the White House like a ghost. His cabinet is split between those who demand the war be continued at any cost and those who quietly admit the fight is lost. The Copperhead Democrats, emboldened by the disaster at Gettysburg, flood Congress with demands for peace. Newspapers in New York scream headlines of defeat, and riots erupt as working men, unwilling to die in a losing war, clash with soldiers sent to enforce the draft. In Richmond, the mood could not be more different. Bells ring in celebration, churches overflow with worshippers giving thanks for the miracle at Gettysburg, and Jefferson Davis strides through the Capitol with renewed confidence. The Confederacy, long starved of good news, now basks in glory. Diplomats are dispatched across the Atlantic, carrying the story of victory to London and Paris. European bankers, once hesitant to invest in Confederate bonds, now open their purses. Recognition, long withheld, now seems inevitable. On the battlefield, Lee makes his most daring move yet. Instead of retreating south to defend Virginia, he pushes eastward toward Baltimore. His aim is not merely another victory, but the political heart of the Union. If Baltimore falls, the northern states may fracture beyond repair. Meade, unable to regroup his battered army in time, watches helplessly as Confederate banners rise where Union authority once held firm. The blow is not only military, but psychological. For the first time, the Union appears vulnerable, perhaps even doomed. Meanwhile, in the West, the picture is more complicated. Ulysses S. Grant still besieges Vicksburg, and in this altered timeline, his determination is as fierce as ever. But the Confederate triumph in Pennsylvania reverberates even along the Mississippi. Reinforcements that might have gone to aid Grant are redirected eastward to protect northern cities. Supplies run thin, and Union commanders begin to wonder whether even the great river can be conquered if the government in Washington collapses. The Union war effort, stretched across thousands of miles, now teeters under the strain of defeat. Yet for all the triumph, cracks appear within the Confederacy itself. Soldiers exult in their victories, but remain half-starved, their uniforms in tatters, their boots worn through. Farms back home lie in ruin, stripped bare to feed the army. Enslaved people, emboldened by the chaos of war, continue to escape to Union lines or rise up against their masters. Lee knows that his victories, glorious though they are, cannot be sustained indefinitely unless peace is forced soon. The South's strength, like a candle burning brightly, risks being consumed too quickly. Still, the strategic momentum cannot be denied. In September of 1863, as Confederate troops march into Baltimore, Britain makes its move. The government formally recognizes the Confederate States of America, extending diplomatic relations and hinting at the possibility of military aid should the Union continue to resist. Napoleon III of France, eager to support his adventure in Mexico, follows suit. For Lincoln, it is a nightmare realized. The United States now stands isolated, facing not only internal rebellion, but the weight of European diplomacy aligned against it. In the smoky halls of Congress, voices cry out for negotiation. Senators demand Lincoln sue for peace before foreign armies intervene. Some whisper that he should resign altogether, that his presidency has become a curse upon the nation. The great experiment of American democracy, it seems, is unraveling before the eyes of the world. On the battlefield, the thunder of cannon continues. But the war is no longer fought solely in trenches and cornfields. It rages in newspaper headlines, in diplomatic salons across Europe, and in the hearts of millions who wonder if the Union has already breathed its last. The Confederacy, born in fire, now strides boldly into the realm of legitimacy. And as Baltimore falls under the shadow of the Southern flag, the question becomes ever sharper. Will the United States itself survive, or will the experiment of union perish upon the anvil of war? The winter of 1863 descends not as a season of peace, but as a season of reckoning. Snow falls over the scarred fields of Pennsylvania, blanketing shallow graves and shattered fences, while in Washington the government clings desperately to life. Lincoln, gaunt and weary, refuses to resign, but his circle grows smaller by the day. His critics in Congress denounce him as the president who presided over disunion and disaster. Copperhead newspapers call openly for negotiations with Richmond, declaring that further bloodshed is pointless when the Confederacy has already proved its independence on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, the Confederate Army digs in. For the first time, a major northern city lies under Southern occupation. The sight of gray-coated soldiers marching through its streets sends shockwaves across the Union. Shops are stripped bare, warehouses emptied to feed Lee's men, and terrified citizens weigh whether resistance is worth the price. The stars and bars flutter above government buildings, a bitter symbol that the Confederacy is no longer fighting for survival, it is dictating terms. Lee, however, remains cautious. His triumph is undeniable, but he knows that every mile deeper into the north stretches his supply lines thinner. His men are exhausted, their rations meager, and reinforcements scarce. For the Confederacy, this is the paradox of victory. The brighter the flame burns, the faster it consumes the fuel. Lee presses Jefferson Davis for more troops, but the South is already bled white. Farms lie fallow, railroads groan under shortages, and thousands of enslaved people continue to flee at the first sign of Union lines. Victory has brought glory, but not relief. Across the Atlantic, diplomacy moves with lightning speed. Britain's recognition of the Confederacy emboldens France, Spain, and even smaller European states to treat Richmond as a legitimate power. Confederate commissioners attend grand dinners in London, their gray uniforms polished, their words laced with promises of endless cotton. In return, ships laden with rifles, boots, and cannons slip across the Atlantic, defying the Union blockade with the backing of European navies. The North, once confident in its naval supremacy, suddenly finds itself facing the possibility of international intervention. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant stands at a crossroads. Vicksburg is still under siege, but now rumors spread that reinforcements may never come. Supplies trickle in slowly, and news of Northern defeat crushes morale. Yet Grant is not a man easily broken. He pushes forward relentlessly, determined to crack the South along the Mississippi, even as politicians in Washington whisper that the Union cannot afford further losses. His soldiers, ragged but loyal, cling to the belief that if any man can salvage victory, it is Grant. But even he senses the tide has shifted. Each day, reports arrive of Confederate successes, of northern cities falling into chaos, of European ships appearing off the coast. The Union itself begins to fracture. Governors in states like New York and Ohio, facing riots and economic collapse, quietly open back channels to Confederate agents. They hope to secure peace for their people, even if it means abandoning the idea of a united republic. Lincoln, isolated and increasingly desperate, vows to continue the struggle, but his words no longer inspire as they once did. In the streets of Washington, whispers grow louder. Perhaps the time has come to sue for peace. For the Confederacy, the moment seems ripe to strike a killing blow. Jefferson Davis urges Lee to march on Washington, to seize the capital, and force Lincoln's surrender. Yet Lee hesitates. The city is heavily fortified, bristling with artillery, and defended by soldiers who, though beaten, will fight with the desperation of cornered men. To assault Washington could end in disaster, squandering the very gains his army had bled for. Instead, Lee seeks a subtler weapon: political collapse. If the North tears itself apart, there will be no need for another bloody siege. The Confederacy can win not only on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. Still, battles rage on. In Tennessee, Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg push northward, emboldened by Lee's victories, clashing with Union troops in skirmishes that tear through mountain passes and fertile valleys alike. In Missouri, guerrilla warfare intensifies as irregular fighters strike railroads and Union outposts, spreading terror across the frontier. Every new front strains the Union further, bleeding it from 1,000 cuts. By the dawn of 1864, the war has transformed into something more than a struggle between two armies. It is now a war of endurance between two visions of America, one united but broken, the other divided yet triumphant. The Confederacy has proved it can stand, and the Union trembles on the verge of collapse. And yet, as winter fades and spring approaches, both sides prepare for the campaigns that will decide everything. The next battles will not only shape the outcome of the war, they will determine whether the idea of the United States itself survives at all. Spring of 1864 arrives with the crack of musket fire and the rumble of artillery wheels. The war that began with such confidence now stands on the razor's edge, and both sides know it. For the Confederacy, the victories at Gettysburg and Baltimore have brought glory and recognition, but they have not ended the struggle. For the Union, survival itself demands one final, desperate gamble. The stage is set for a confrontation that will decide not only the fate of two armies, but the destiny of an entire continent. In this alternate timeline, Lee chooses his battleground carefully. Washington remains too fortified, too dangerous to assault directly, but he understands the symbolism of threatening the Union's heart. His army, though worn and battered, marches southward once more, intending to strike in Virginia and crush any Union attempt at resurgence. Meanwhile, Confederate commanders in the West coordinate with European advisors newly arrived from Britain and France. Rifles stamped with foreign marks glisten in the sun, and whispers spread among Union soldiers that they now face not only their countrymen but the shadow of European power. Lincoln, refusing to surrender, turns to his last card, Grant. The man who had clawed victories from the mud of Tennessee and held firm at Vicksburg is summoned east, given command of all Union armies. His orders are simple, brutal, and nearly impossible. Break Lee, no matter the cost. Grant does not hesitate. He understands that the Union cannot afford endless retreats, that morale is collapsing, and that only a relentless offensive can restore faith in the cause. The clash between Grant and Lee, long delayed, now ignites across Virginia's forests and rivers. The battles that follow are cataclysmic. In the wilderness, tangled thickets catch fire under the fury of cannonades, and men burn alive in the choking smoke. At Spotsylvania, soldiers claw at each other in trenches filled with rain and blood, fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets and rifle butts. Lee maneuvers brilliantly, holding ground, counterattacking with the precision of a master. Yet Grant does not break. Unlike previous Union generals, he does not retreat after losses. He presses forward, again and again, grinding his army against Lee's defenses like waves battering a cliff. But here, in this alternate history, the tide flows differently. European support begins to tip the scales. Shipments of supplies slip through the blockade with British protection, filling Confederate ranks with powder and shot just as Union stocks dwindle. Southern morale, once fragile, surges anew. And at Cold Harbor, where in our reality, Union soldiers were slaughtered in futile assaults, Lee seizes the moment. His artillery, reinforced with French guns, shreds Grant's advancing columns. Tens of thousands fall in hours. Survivors carve the words, "We charge at daylight," and it means death, into scraps of paper to pin on their uniforms. The Union Army staggers. Even Grant, hardened by years of bloodshed, knows the blow is mortal. He withdraws, unable to maintain momentum. Lee, sensing opportunity, launches a counteroffensive that drives Union forces back toward the Potomac. Washington once again trembles under the shadow of Confederate guns. Lincoln pleads with his generals to hold, but the truth cannot be denied. The North's will is broken. Riots erupt in New York, Chicago, and Boston, fueled by rage at the endless slaughter. Copperhead politicians call for Lincoln's resignation and open peace with Richmond. Soldiers desert in droves, slipping back to their farms and families, unwilling to fight for a cause that seems lost. Even within the Republican Party, voices whisper that the Union cannot endure another year of such misery. The great dream of a single, indivisible republic is unraveling under the weight of defeat. For the Confederacy, the moment is nothing less than destiny. Jefferson Davis declares that the war has entered its final phase, that recognition from Britain and France has proved the South's place among nations. Lee, ever cautious, tempers triumph with warning. His men are exhausted, their numbers finite, their homes still suffering. But he cannot deny that victory is within reach. And so, by late summer of 1864, the war reaches its crescendo. The Union, staggering and divided, faces collapse. The Confederacy, against all odds, stands ascendant, its banners carried proudly across battlefields once thought forever lost. In this world, the thunder of cannon does not mark the salvation of the Union, but its slow, tragic disintegration. Yet as the guns fall silent, another question rises from the smoke. If the Confederacy survives, what kind of nation will it become? And what will that mean for the future of the world? By the autumn of 1864, the great American experiment lay in ruins. The Union, fractured and exhausted, signed treaties that recognized the independence of the Confederate States of America. There was no Appomattox courthouse, no triumphant reunification beneath the stars and stripes. Instead, there were two nations where once there had been one, glaring at each other across a blood-soaked border. The dream of a united America had died on the fields of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and its ghost would haunt the world for generations. In the North, bitterness and despair ran deep. Lincoln, broken by defeat, faced political annihilation. His opponents seized control of Congress, denouncing him as the president who had squandered countless lives only to lose the Union itself. Some whispered that history would brand him a tyrant, others that he was a martyr to a cause too pure to survive. Yet for millions of Northerners, the collapse of the Union was not only a political defeat, but a personal one. They had buried fathers, brothers, and sons in endless rows of graves, only to see the nation for which they died divided forever. The Confederacy, meanwhile, basked in its triumph. Richmond became the beating heart of a new Southern republic, its leaders hailed as statesmen rather than rebels. The flags of Britain and France flew alongside the stars and bars in formal ceremonies, cementing recognition of the South's sovereignty. Trade routes reopened, and cotton once again flowed across the Atlantic, feeding the mills of Manchester and Lyon. Southern planters, their fortunes revived, congratulated themselves on having preserved their world. Slavery, the cornerstone of that world, remained intact, protected not only by law, but now by the legitimacy of international diplomacy. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks spread quickly. The Confederacy had won its independence, but at staggering cost. Its countryside was scarred, its population devastated, its economy fragile. Enslaved people, denied freedom by the Union's collapse, resisted more fiercely than ever, fleeing into borderlands or organizing uprisings that forced Confederate soldiers to fight not only external enemies, but internal unrest. Planters demanded harsher laws, patrols grew more brutal, and the South sank deeper into the iron grip of its own contradictions. The North, for its part, licked its wounds but did not vanish. The United States remained a formidable power, its industries still growing, its immigrant population still surging. But its sense of destiny was shattered. The idea of manifest destiny, of a continent united under one flag, had evaporated. The western frontier became contested ground, with settlers unsure whether to pledge loyalty to Washington or Richmond. Territories that once dreamed of statehood now found themselves pawns in a geopolitical chess game between two rival American republics. And beyond the continent, the consequences rippled outward. Europe, long wary of a united America's rising power, now looked with satisfaction on a divided hemisphere. Britain tightened its grip on Canada, relieved that its northern neighbor was weakened and distracted. France pressed its ambitions in Mexico, confident that neither Washington nor Richmond could mount serious resistance. The Monroe Doctrine, once a bold declaration against European meddling in the New World, now rang hollow. The Americas, instead of a bastion of Republican independence, had become a playground for imperial powers. Culturally, the split deepened with every passing year. The North, increasingly industrial, moved toward wage labor, urban growth, and technological innovation. The South, insulated by victory, clung to its agrarian aristocracy, its wealth built on human bondage. Where the United States celebrated free soil and free labor, the Confederacy exalted hierarchy and tradition. Two visions of civilization, once locked within a single union, now stood as separate nations, destined to evolve further apart, their rivalry sharpening with each decade. And always, lingering in the background, was the question of freedom. 4 million enslaved men, women, and children had seen the promise of emancipation rise like a distant star, only to watch it extinguished in the smoke of defeat. Their chains remained, their hopes deferred. The Confederacy had bought its independence at the cost of their future, and the legacy of that choice would poison the South's triumph. For every victory parade in Richmond, there were fields where human beings still toiled in bondage, their cries echoing unheard. Thus, by the close of 1864, the world stood upon the edge of a new era. The United States was humbled but alive. The Confederacy was triumphant but fragile. Two nations occupied the land where one had stood, their destinies entwined in rivalry, suspicion, and unhealed wounds. The Civil War had ended not in reconciliation, but in division. And the true consequences of that division were only beginning to unfold. For if the Confederacy could survive its birth, what kind of power would it grow into? And how would its survival reshape not just America, but the world itself? The Confederacy's victory, secured on the fields of Gettysburg and Baltimore, cast a long and complex shadow over the rest of the 19th century. In the immediate years after the treaties of recognition, the South stood proudly as a sovereign nation. Its leaders spoke of liberty, honor, and tradition, parading beneath banners that proclaimed independence. But beneath the rhetoric lay a truth the world could not ignore. The Confederacy had been built on the foundation of human bondage, and its survival ensured that slavery would not vanish, but instead be fortified for generations. As the 1870s dawned, Richmond sought to consolidate its fragile victory. Foreign trade, bolstered by Britain and France, poured money into Confederate ports. Cotton once again became king, its white fields stretching across the South like rivers of gold. With that wealth, the Confederate elite rebuilt their mansions, restored plantations, and doubled down on the system that had brought them to war. Enslaved people, denied emancipation, remained trapped, their labor exploited to fuel the Southern dream. Rebellions simmered constantly. Secret networks formed, uprisings flared, and every plantation required vigilant patrols to maintain order. Victory had secured independence, but it had not solved the Confederacy's deepest contradiction. In the North, the shock of defeat slowly gave way to reinvention. Cut off from the fertile fields of the South, industry accelerated. Immigrants flooded into New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, working in mills, forges, and shipyards. The United States became a nation of steel and smoke, determined to prove that its future did not depend on Southern cotton. Railroads stretched westward, binding the frontier to Washington's authority. By the 1880s, the North had become a titan of industry, producing locomotives, weapons, and machines at a scale the South could not hope to match. Yet even as it prospered, the wound of division festered. The dream of manifest destiny, once a unifying force, now existed in two competing visions. Washington pushing west with free labor, Richmond seeking to extend slavery into new territories. The rivalry between the two Americas turned the continent into a chessboard of conflict. In Kansas, Missouri, and the territories of the Great Plains, settlers declared loyalty to one flag or the other, sparking skirmishes and proxy wars. In Mexico, French ambitions thrived under Confederate backing, while the Union tried to counter with its own alliances. The Monroe Doctrine, once bold, collapsed into irrelevance as European powers used the fractured Americas as pawns in their imperial games. The Western Hemisphere, far from a united bastion of liberty, became a patchwork of competing empires and client states. Culturally, the divide widened. The United States celebrated progress, free labor, public schools, urban growth. The Confederacy exalted hierarchy and tradition, where an aristocracy of planters dominated politics and culture. Southern cities like New Orleans and Richmond developed their own proud identities, but they remained tethered to an agrarian economy. The South, wealthy in cotton but poor in industry, leaned heavily on European support, creating a dependency that stunted its long-term strength. The North, by contrast, surged toward modernity, forging a sense of destiny not through unity, but through rivalry. For the enslaved, the future was bleak. Generations passed with freedom deferred, their hopes raised and crushed by the tides of war. In the United States, abolitionist voices remained loud, condemning the South across every pulpit and newspaper. Underground networks continued to spirit fugitives across hostile borders, sparking diplomatic crises between Washington and Richmond. Each escaped man or woman was a symbol of defiance, each confrontation a reminder that the issue of slavery, though settled by war, remained alive and poisonous. By the close of the 19th century, the rivalry between North and South hardened into something far larger. Two Americas existed side by side, one industrial, restless, and modern, the other agrarian, aristocratic, and bound to slavery. Their competition spilled into every frontier, every diplomatic table, every negotiation of power. And with each passing decade, the possibility of another war grew. For though the Confederacy had survived its birth, the question lingered like a storm on the horizon. Could two rival Americas truly share a continent without once again reaching for the sword? And so, as the century turned, the world braced for the next chapter in this alternate history, a world where the South had won, but victory carried with it consequences as dark and uncertain as the war itself. The story of a Confederate victory does not end with parades in Richmond or treaties signed in European capitals. It stretches forward through decades, shaping the destiny of millions, casting shadows across continents. For in this alternate history, the United States is no longer a beacon of unity, but a fractured dream. Two republics share the land, each glaring at the other with suspicion, each convinced of its righteousness, each preparing for the next confrontation. The Confederacy, triumphant though it seems, carries within it the seeds of its own instability. Its triumph preserved slavery, but preservation is not a permanence. As the 19th century advances, new voices rise even within the South, voices of dissent, whispers of rebellion, murmurs of conscience. The enslaved resist ceaselessly, their struggles woven into the fabric of daily life, their yearning for freedom unquenchable. Every harvest, every march to the cotton fields carries the weight of defiance. Victory on the battlefield cannot silence the human spirit forever. The United States, battered but alive, finds its strength not in the memory of unity, but in the forge of rivalry. Industry booms, cities tower, and inventions reshape daily life. Yet always, on its southern border, stands a reminder of failure. A rival nation that mocks its ideals, a mirror reflecting what it might have become. The Union, stripped of its moral triumph, must redefine itself not as the savior of freedom, but as a republic humbled, determined to rise again. And the world, watching from afar, recalibrates its vision of America. No longer a singular giant striding confidently across the continent, but two competing powers whose rivalry weakens the hemisphere. Europe, unchallenged, extends its reach. Empires meddle in Latin America, carve influence in the Caribbean, exploit divisions that never should have existed. The balance of power tilts away from the New World, leaving the Americas vulnerable to the ambitions of kings and emperors. Yet beyond politics and power, the deepest question lingers in the hearts of ordinary people. What does liberty mean in a world where millions remain enslaved? What does democracy mean when a republic can fracture under the weight of its contradictions? What does destiny mean when history itself bends upon the blade of chance? These are questions not only for the imagined Confederacy, but for us, as we look back through the smoke of this alternate past. Because this is, after all, a story of what might have been. In our world, the Union endured. The Confederacy fell, slavery was abolished, though at terrible cost, and the United States emerged, scarred but whole. But if the scales had tipped differently, if Lee's gamble at Gettysburg had paid off, our world would be unrecognizable. A divided America, a continent torn between two rival republics, a future where freedom itself might have withered on the vine. And so we ask you, as the echoes of cannon fade and the banners of history are furled, would you want to live in that world? A world where the South had won the American Civil War? Would the promise of liberty still shine, or would it flicker, dimmed by the triumph of bondage and division? History, in the end, is not inevitable. It is fragile, contingent, shaped by choices, by courage, by chance. Our past could have been very different. Our present might have been a stranger place. And our future is still ours to decide. Now it's your turn to reflect. What do you think of this alternate timeline? Would the Confederacy have survived the pressures of modernity? Would the United States have risen again in vengeance? Or would both nations have doomed each other to endless conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey through history's shadow has left you with new questions, new ideas, or even new chills, don't forget to like this video and share it with friends. Because history, real or imagined, is never just about the past. It's about who we are today and who we might yet become.